So I remember when we first got here to Door County and I saw that picture of that windy, curvy road to Northport, and I actually thought it was a fake. Because no road would be built like that, right? And then somebody said, well, it's up at Northport, and I still was a skeptic. No road would be built like that. So I went there, and there was a road built like that. It's real. I've been there, as I'm sure many of you have. And as dramatic as the photos are, and there's all kinds of dramatic photos, especially in the fall season, I think it's actually even better in person. I'm sure there's a story behind it, and probably most of you know that story. I don't know the story, so you have to tell me. But the windy, curvy road to Northport serves this evening as a metaphor for the unpredictable and constantly changing nature of life. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We can't predict the future. And yet the reality is we are still called to make decisions about the future, make decisions about that which we know nothing about. Discernment is the intentional practice by which we make decisions about the future differently. We seek to make choices in our lives from the perspective that God is at work in our lives and God is at work in the world. And so we seek to align our decisions with that notion that God is at work. You know, when it comes to making decisions, it turns out we're actually not very good at it. In their book called Decisive, Chip and Dan Heath engage in a long study of our human decision-making process and the capacity that we have to make decisions. Well, I'm going to distill the essence of the book into one sentence. We are very good at convincing ourselves that we're good at making decisions, but in reality, in most cases, we would be better off just to flip a coin. The Christian practice of discernment is different than decision-making. We are still called to make choices in our lives, but discerning a decision requires the ability to slow down and to make space for the voice of the living God. We seek to be aware of what God is doing in the world and what God is doing in our lives. You've probably heard of Ignatius of Loyola. He was a 16th century Spanish priest who had formerly been a military captain, had a conversion experience, and founded the order that we now know as the Jesuits. And as part of that spirituality of the Jesuits, he formulated a process of discernment that requires a passionate commitment to follow God, an attitude of indifference towards our own personal wants and desires, and then a deep sensitivity to the ways and being of God. And so with both Ignatius and with some of the other Christian practices of discernment, here are the key components. And by the way, I've summarized these on a sheet. If you can't remember what I say tonight, there's a sheet that you can pick up on the way out tonight. So the first thing is to bring the decision before God and ask God's guidance in making that decision. The truth is there is no substitute for prayer. Remember, prayer is not just our talking to God, but prayer is also allowing times and space and silence so that we can listen for the voice of the Spirit. Another part of discernment is simply to slow down. Far too often we are driven to make a quick decision, and in our haste we don't allow the time to let things really sink in, to listen for the voice of the Spirit and to listen to our own deep inner voice. When we slow down, we create the space to allow ourselves to be aware of as many of the dimensions of the decision as possible. And so we investigate information. We weigh the pros and cons. And here is where, dear friends, our Christian community comes in. We sit down with trusted friends, especially friends of faith, who are also seeking to discern God's action in their lives. And we go over the options with them and we ask them their opinions. What is the best use of my gifts? How do you see the options that I'm faced with? And here's one of the genius of the Ignatian way of doing discernment. He invites us to consider the negatives, to take the decision that we are least likely to make and to live with that decision for a while. And so when we live with that decision we are least likely to make, what feelings of consolation or desolation emerge? Feelings of consolation are those feelings that give rise to joy and life and peace and creativity and communion. Those feelings are harmonious with the Spirit, even if they happen to be something we don't necessarily want to do. Feelings of desolation give despair and confusion and alienation and destructiveness and discord. And those are the feelings that are not harmonious with the Spirit. They're the things that suck the life right out of us. Then Ignatius invites us to consider the same process with that decision we are most likely to make, and live with that idea for a while. And so when you live with that positive side of it for a while, are you having feelings of consolation or desolation? Which choice gives rise to the feelings that are the fruit of the Spirit, love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and gentleness? And finally, take action in order to complete the discernment process. Discernment really very rarely leads to certainty. Rather, the action itself is a part of the discernment process, and sometimes that action reveals that we have been misguided, and then we have to start the process all over again. One of the most challenging things in life is when we face hard choices, especially choices that represent important turning points in our lives. Part of the abundant life that Jesus came to bring for us is to rely on the voice of the Spirit and the gentle promptings of a God who loves us deeply as we make those important decisions. Life may often feel like that curvy, windy road to Northport, but we can be confident that we never have to go down that road alone.